guys, welcome back to the Thoughtful Therapist podcast. I'm Dr. Jimmy Slaughter. This podcast is all about trying to understand the way that we think about the world and ourselves and our reality within it. So let's take this one thought at a time. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about knowledge, wisdom, and faith, and how we should seek them. Right? Like, how do we seek faith, truth, and wisdom and meaning? Lately, I've been wondering if we've inherited a story that just isn't quite true. A story that says science, philosophy, and faith are all on competing teams. That at some point, religion gave way to philosophy, then philosophy gave way to science. Almost like civilization has been climbing a ladder. Each time it's on a new rung, it leaves the past one behind as it moves towards something better. But the more I've looked at history, the less convinced I am that this is what's actually happened. When I look back, I don't see three separate worlds. I see civilizations asking the biggest questions they could have ever imagined. Who are we? Why are we here? How should we live? What is this place? Can we know what it is? Can we predict it? Can we trust it? And over thousands of years, it seems like humanity has developed three remarkable traditions to start answering some of these questions. And those three are faith, philosophy, and science. They're not identical. They're not interchangeable. But I think they might be far more connected than we've been led to believe so far. So today, I don't want to ask which one is right. Today, I want to ask something different. What is each one actually trying to accomplish? So let's start where almost every civilization seems to begin, with faith. Now, when I say faith, please understand I don't simply mean organized religion. While religion is one expression of faith, it is not what I'm attempting to describe here. What I mean is something much broader. Faith has and trust and commitment and orienting yourself towards something larger than your immediate experience. And I have not always been open to faith, like at all. In fact, I had a conversation at a friend's funeral that really changed how I thought about it. But that's probably a story for another day. Now, different traditions place that trust in different places. God, the Tao, Dharma, our ancestors, nature, harmony, or just even ultimate reality itself. The answers differ dramatically between civilization and civilization, but the invitation often sounds surprisingly familiar. Be humble, practice compassion, sacrifice for something larger than yourself, remain disciplined, hope, forgive, and love. Almost every faith tradition asks something of its participants. And in return, it offers something. Normally something in the arena of meaning, a sense of belonging, a purpose, peace, liberation, harmony, salvation, hope, different promises, but they fill a remarkably similar human need. And what seems common across these traditions is not a set of identical beliefs, but more like a posture, maybe a willingness. It's that willingness, like I said, to orient ourselves towards something larger than us, even when the larger reality can't be fully proven or controlled. Faith at its best is much less about, claiming certainty and more about practicing trust. Trust that meaning is possible, that your sacrifice can be worthwhile, that humility and compassion are not naive traits. Now, of course, even this posture can and has hardened. when faith becomes primarily about defending the correct answers or interpretations rather than living the questions, I think it loses the very openness that it once incited, or invited rather. And what fascinates me isn't that these traditions agree, they clearly do not. But what fascinates me is that every civilization we've discovered seems to have developed some kind of shared system of meaning. Why? What problem were they solving? I don't know, perhaps civilizations require more than food, more than shelter. Perhaps they require shared stories and values, a shared purpose, reasons to cooperate with people who aren't just family. Now, that's not really proof of anything. It's just something that I've noticed. And here, I think I'd like to try a little thought experiment. So imagine there are only 100 of us, 100 people. No cities, no governments, no universities, no laboratories, just 100 people trying to survive. What's the first thing that we're worried about? It's not philosophy. It's not astronomy. Certainly not quantum mechanics. I think we'd probably be hungry. I think we'd be, well, I live in Florida, but a lot of us would be cold. And I think mainly just trying not to die. Survival. And then pretty quickly, we realize something. One person is not very good at surviving, but 100 people are. Hunt together, gather together, defend each other, raise children together. And then suddenly me becomes us. But now we've kind of created a brand new problem. If we're going to live together, we need to trust one another. Some might argue that we need some level of rules or expectations, reasons not to steal from each other, reasons not to kill one another, reasons to sacrifice for children that aren't even our own. And maybe more importantly, like solid reasons to care about tomorrow. And it seems like this is where the earliest forms of faith kind of begin. Again, not necessarily with organized religion as we know it today, but with shared meaning and shared narrative or a story acted out through values and rituals, but larger than the one person. They need something that allows 100 people to become one community. Now, as time passes, crops would start growing. Our children would survive, have children of their own. And at some point, some of the elders no longer need to spend every waking hour hunting or gathering. Maybe they finally have time to sit down and think. And eventually someone asks the dangerous question. Why? Why these rules? Why this story? Why this deity? Why this way of living? Could we be wrong? Then maybe that's where philosophy begins. And it's not because there was a failure of faith, but there was more time for curiosity to grow. And then, years down the line, another person notices something. Every year, that bright star appears just before the rains. Every spring, the river floods. Every time you plant here instead of there, the harvest is better. And instead of simply just noticing this, they begin writing it down, comparing it, testing it, and predicting it. And it seems like something like this is probably where science begins. Again, not as a replacement of philosophy or faith, it's just asking a whole different kind of question. Can we know our environment well enough to predict what happens next so we can plan our lives? Now, of course, history wasn't nearly as simple as this little thought experiment. Civilizations developed it differently. Traditions overlapped, cultures borrowed from one another. But I do find this thought experiment helpful because it reminds me that perhaps these weren't competing ideas. They could have just been different responses to different problems. And of course, this is a simplified picture. That civilization didn't develop in neat stages. And many thrived with really different balances of those elements. But the point of the thought experiment isn't to claim that this is how it unfolded. It's simply to notice that these human responses, the need for shared meaning, the need for questions and assumptions, and the need to test what we can reliably know, they keep appearing because they solve different kinds of problems. And maybe for them, it even changed faith, right? So like maybe now it's not a required belief in God, but it could be trust in the way of life that they've created, trust in the rains coming after they see that star. It's that orientation towards something beyond the isolated self. That's what I'm calling like faith, I guess, in its broadest sense. Take the Maya. They spent centuries making remarkably precise astronomical observations, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, Venus with an incredible accuracy. Now, these observations weren't simply scientific, they were agricultural, political, religious. The categories were all intertwined. Or you could even consider the calendar hanging on my wall or that's attached to my calendar app on my phone. The Gregorian calendar wasn't created by a secular committee. It was commissioned by Pope Gregory XIII. And much of the astronomical and mathematical work behind it was carried out by the Jesuit priest Christopher Clavius. One of the most widely used scientific tools in the world today emerged from a religious institution trying to solve a practical astronomical problem. And history is filled with examples like this. Ancient Egypt, ancient India, the Islamic Golden Age, China, the Maya, again and again. Faith, philosophy, and science seem to grow together rather than apart. But the relationship between these traditions has never been only cooperative, or it maybe even rarely is cooperative. History is also just full of tension, suppression of ideas, and real conflict. Philosophical schools have been banned. I mean, even Socrates was killed for his beliefs, well, according to Plato. Scientific findings have been silenced when they threaten religious or political authority. Religious institutions have at times claimed the right to decide what could be questioned. And in the modern era, the reverse has sometimes occurred, where certain forms of faith and meaning-making are dismissed as inherently irrational. The conversation between all of these has often been messy, political, and costly for the people involved. And that part of the record matters too. Still, even through the friction, these three ways of asking have continued to shape one another. The question is whether we will keep them in conversation or let the old hostilities harden into permanent camps. So at some point, another question begins to emerge. Not simply what should we believe, but how do we know? What counts as a good reason? What assumptions am I already making without, observing the world around me appropriately? And that's philosophy. It didn't begin in one place. In Greece, thinkers began examining the foundations of knowledge, ethics, and reality itself. In India, philosophers explored the nature of self, perception, and liberation with extraordinary precision. No, seriously, like we're still catching up to some of it. In China, they asked how a person should live in right relationship with the larger order of things. Across cultures, people started turning the light of inquiry not only onto the world, but onto the act of inquiry itself. So asking questions about asking questions. And philosophy asks something different. It asks us to be curious and to maintain that curiosity and to make sure that it doesn't stop at and to make sure that it doesn't stop when answers are uncomfortable. The discipline of following an argument, even when it unsettles us or what we prefer to believe, a wonderful idea. To encourage dialogue instead of declaration, and the humility to admit we might be wrong. In return, it doesn't promise certainty. It just promises clearer thinking, better questions, and a more coherent way of living with uncertainty. But philosophy's influence isn't only abstract. A huge portion of the world we actually live in was shaped directly by it. The idea that rulers should be accountable to something beyond their own power, maybe the people. The idea that justice should be more than just the will of the strongest people. The idea that human beings have dignity and rights that aren't simply granted by the state. The basic structures of law, democracy, and ethical debate that we still argue within today. All of these things carry the fingerprints of philosophical work done centuries ago. We don't always notice it, because these ideas have become the background for ordinary life, at least in the West. But they didn't appear out of nowhere. They were argued for, refined, contested, and passed down through a long, spanning line of work of people who insisted on asking what a good society, a just law, and a meaningful life might actually require. Now, of course, philosophy can lose its way just as the others can. It can become cleverness without any wisdom, that endless analysis that never risks a conclusion. It can turn into another form of tribal belonging, where the goal is to sound as sophisticated as possible rather than to see the world more clearly. And when that happens, it stops serving the search for wisdom and, again, just starts protecting its own territory. But at its best, philosophy remains the discipline that keeps asking the question that the other two sometimes prefer to leave alone, which is, what are we actually doing when we claim to know something? Why does truth matter? And what kind of life is worth living once we know the answer to that? Now, again, these questions didn't replace faith, and they didn't invent science either, but they created the intellectual space in which both could be examined more carefully, and in which science eventually became possible. Let me give you a small example that surprised me. Imagine I'm your biology 101 professor, and I hold up a picture of an eye, an eyeball, and I ask, what is this? How would you respond? Like, to really think about your answer. My guess is that you would say something like, it's the organ we use to see. Fair enough. Now, what is a heart? Your answer would probably be something like the organ that pumps blood. A lung, the organ we use to breathe. And if you wanted to get more specific, that provides oxygen to our blood to carry around our body. But nonetheless, the organ we use to breathe. It's not wrong. It's interesting, though, because those answers feel natural. Like, of course, that's what they are. But they're also remarkably ancient. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle described living things in terms of what they were for. The eye is for seeing. The heart is for circulating blood throughout the body. We call this the teleological language. We're describing something by its function. not by what it is. And you'll notice a tremendous amount of science still uses teleology as opposed to science for descriptions of things. Like, we could go down the rabbit hole of evolution and exactly how the eye became to be so that it is, but that's not the language that we use in science. Well, basic science anyway. But it isn't just biology either. Think about how we define almost everything. Like, what's a chair? Something you sit on. What's a road? That's a paved piece of ground that gets you somewhere. What's a house? Somewhere people live. What's a school? A place where people learn. We instinctively organize much of reality by asking, what is it for? Now, modern biology gives us something Aristotle never had, like evolution, genetics, development, natural selection. And it gives us an extraordinary explanation of, again, how that eye developed millions of years ago. And that's one of the great achievements of science. But here's what's interesting. In that experiment, when I asked a first-year biology student, what is an eye? Almost nobody begins with 400 million years of evolutionary history. They simply say, it's for seeing. And I don't think that's because biology is failing. I think it's because philosophy and science are answering different kinds of questions. Science explains how structures develop, while functional language explains the role those structures play. Again, different traditions, but still talking to one another after more than 2,000 years. And maybe that's the bigger lesson. We often imagine that every new tradition replaces the old before it. But perhaps civilization has grown differently than that. Perhaps we've just continued adding new ways of understanding to the very same reality. Now, the scientific method was developed within an intellectual tradition that treats the honest pursuit of truth as a fundamental virtue. I've always loved that saying. I think that's great. Because science isn't simply a list of procedures. It asks something of the scientist. Tell the truth. Report what you actually found. Let someone else criticize your work. Be willing to abandon your favorite theory if reality disagrees. And remain humble before the evidence. Now, those aren't just techniques, those are virtues. And science has transformed, a civilization, medicine. We have electricity now, the internet, vaccines. We can forecast weather, explore space, dive to the deepest depths of the ocean. We learned that washing our hands saved lives. Millions of lives have been saved because of washing hands. We have predictive models now that can detect hurricanes. We are gaining understanding into how stars form, at least according to our current models. And one of the most beautiful things about science is that those models continue to change. New discoveries surprise us daily. Old theories improve. Bad theories go away. Or at least they're meant to go away. Reality just keeps humbling us in science. And I'm not saying that science is failing, because it's not. It's working exactly as it should. But again, something interesting happens here. Science asks how. How does gravity work? How do stars form? How does evolution produce eyes? How does consciousness emerge? That one's also in philosophy, though, and maybe a little faith. But those are extraordinary questions. And eventually, another question begins to appear. Why should we care about truth in the first place? If science can tell us how to discover truth, it cannot, by experiment alone, tell us why truth is worth pursuing. That question belongs somewhere else. So then philosophy would begin asking, why is truth good? Why should honesty matter? And what is a good life? Well, the faith traditions would ask, what kind of a person should truth make us become? And it's funny because in this example, those faith traditions are talking again, not competing. Building on each other, talking. And looking at them this way, it's hard not to notice how far the conversation has drifted in our own time. Faith, philosophy, and science have all in different ways hardened. And each has moments where it's more concerned with protecting its territory than with the original work it was meant to do. Now, with faith, of course, this posture can harden. When faith starts to become primarily about defending its members and its viewpoints, it loses something. And we see this when religious institutions protect people who have caused serious harm in order to preserve the institution's reputation and authority, rather than prioritizing those who were hurt. The need for group belonging and institutional power, or just certainty of owning the truth, can turn a living tradition into something rigid and more concerned with who is in and who is out than with the original work of the meaning. It loses all of its humility and care. And philosophy, too, can lose its way. Right? As I said earlier, it can become a position where being clever is more important than being wise. Where we stop wanting to analyze things in a way that could create a conclusion. It's like when a philosopher goes down a rabbit hole, just looking for an answer that they're comfortable with, and instead they just continue to ask questions ad nauseum. And we see this when the goal of philosophy shifts from seeking understanding to just never being pinned down. Like, as long as you can keep reframing the question or adding another layer of complexity, you will maintain the upper hand and never have to land on anything real. Like when status of being an intellectual or the safety of no permanent critiques can take over, philosophy stops serving the search of wisdom, and again, just begins protecting its own territory. And lastly, science, of course, is not immune either. In that same way that science can ask us to remain humble before evidence, can harden into a tribal identity. We see this when trust the science is used not as an invitation to examine the evidence, but as a way to shut down legitimate questions. And that's not a posture either. That's just like definitionally factual. And the people who keep asking questions about how it might have been done different are treated as dangerous instead of an integral part of the process. Institutional pressures, financial incentives, and our desire for certainty can slowly turn a method of discovery into a source of unexamined authority. And looking at them this way, it's hard not to notice a common pattern. Faith, philosophy, and science have all in different ways hardened in our time. Meaning throughout any of them can almost become dogmatic. And that can be seen pretty clearly when knowledge becomes certainty that refuses to be revised. And when that happens, the long conversation between them starts to break down, and something really important is lost. Perhaps what we need is not for one of them to finally defeat the others, but for each to recover the humility and curiosity that first made the tradition valuable. So maybe the question isn't, should I choose science, or should I choose philosophy, or should I choose faith? As a matter of fact, history would suggest humanity rarely did. Instead, as a species, we've just continued to develop all three of them, constantly in pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, and meaning. and each one of them doing their important job of correcting the others. Each one asking questions that the others couldn't fully answer on their own. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Wisdom without knowledge has no grasp on reality. And meaning without either starts to become that certainty without willingness for correction. So maybe civilization isn't the story of faith replacing philosophy or science replacing philosophy. Maybe it's the story of a species that's just continued to ask better questions. How do we survive? How do we live together? How do we know what's true? How do we test what we've learned? Every generation inherited the conversation and added another chapter. Maybe now it's time for us to make our mark. Maybe that's all civilization has ever been. Just one thought at a time. Thanks for thinking it through with me, the Thoughtful Therapist. I'd like to give a big shout out to Synergy Health Group. They've been unwavering sponsors of this podcast since the beginning, and I greatly appreciate them for that. They've got a handful of licensed clinical mental health counselors that are ready, willing, and able to meet in person, online, however you want it. Synergy Health Group, give them a call. Thanks.